Chapter 35 of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Diana Moilinger. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 35. Things Unalterable. After Philip had passed out of the room, Sylvia lay perfectly still, from very exhaustion. Her mother slept on, happily unconscious of all the turmoil that had taken place. Yes, happily, though the heavy sleep was to end in death. But of this her daughter knew nothing, imagining that it was refreshing slumber, instead of an ebbing of life. Both mother and daughter lay motionless till Phoebe entered the room to tell Sylvia that dinner was on the table. Then Sylvia sat up, and put back her hair, bewildered and uncertain as to what was to be done next, how she should meet the husband to whom she had discarded all allegiance, repudiated the solemn promise of love and obedience which she had vowed. Phoebe came into the room with natural interest in the invalid, scarcely older than herself. "How's the old lady?" asked she, in a low voice. Sylvia turned her head round to look. Her mother had never moved, but was breathing in a loud uncomfortable manner, that made her stoop over her to see the averted face more nearly. "Phoebe!" she cried. "Come here! She looks strange and odd. Her eyes are open, but don't see me. Phoebe! Phoebe!" "Sure enough, she's in a bad way," said Phoebe, climbing stiffly on to the bed to have a nearer view. "Hold her head a little bit to ease her breathing while I go for master. He'll be for sending for the doctor, I'll be bound." Sylvia took her mother's head and laid it fondly on her breast, speaking to her and trying to rouse her, but it was of no avail. The hard stertorous breathing grew worse and worse. Sylvia cried out for help. Nancy came, the baby in her arms. They had been in several times before that morning, and the child came smiling and crowing at its mother, who was supporting her own dying parent. "Oh, Nancy!" said Sylvia, "what is the matter with mother? You can see her face. Tell me quick." Nancy set the baby on the bed for all reply, and ran out of the room, crying out, "Master! Master, come quick! The old missus is a dying." This appeared to be no news to Sylvia, and yet the words came on her with a great shock; but all for that she could not cry. She was surprised herself at her own deadness of feeling. Her baby crawled to her, and she had to hold and guard both her mother and her child. It seemed a long, long time before any one came, and then she heard muffled voices, and a heavy tramp. It was Phoebe leading the doctor upstairs, and Nancy creeping in behind to hear his opinion. He did not ask many questions, and Phoebe replied more frequently to his inquiries than did Sylvia, who looked into his face with a blank, tearless, speechless despair, that gave him more pain than the sight of her dying mother. The long decay of Mrs. Robson's faculties and health, of which he was well aware, had in a certain manner prepared him for some such sudden termination of life whose duration was hardly desirable, although he gave several directions as to her treatment. But the white, pinched face, the great dilated eye, the slow comprehension of the younger woman, struck him with alarm; and he went on asking for various particulars, more with a view of rousing Sylvia, if even it were to tears, than for any other purpose that the information thus obtained could answer. "You had best have pillows propped up behind her. It will not be for long. She does not know that you are holding her, and it is only tiring you to no purpose." Sylvia's terrible stare continued. He put his advice into action, and gently tried to loosen her clasp and tender hold. This she resisted, laying her cheek against her poor mother's unconscious face. "Where is Hepburn?" said he. "He ought to be here." Phoebe looked at Nancy, Nancy at Phoebe. It was the latter who replied. "He is neither in the house nor in the shop. I seed him go past the kitchen window better nor an hour ago, but neither William Coulson nor Hester Rose knows where he is gone to." Dr. Morgan's lips were puckered up into a whistle, but he made no sound. "Give me the baby," he said suddenly. Nancy had taken her up off the bed where she had been sitting, encircled by her mother's arm. The nursemaid gave her to the doctor. He watched the mother's eye, it followed her child, and he was rejoiced. He gave a little pinch to the baby's soft flesh, and she cried out piteously. Again the same action, the same result. Sylvia laid her mother down, and stretched out her arm for her child, hushing it and moaning over it. "So far so good," said Dr. Morgan to himself. "But where is the husband? He ought to be here." He went downstairs to make inquiry for Philip, that poor young creature, about whose health he had never felt thoroughly satisfied since the fever after her confinement, was in an anxious condition, and with an inevitable shock awaiting her. Her husband ought to be with her, and supporting her to bear it. Dr. Morgan went into the shop. Hester was alone there. Coulson had gone to his comfortable dinner at his well-ordered house with his commonplace wife. If he had felt anxious about Philip's looks and strange disappearance, he had also managed to account for them in some indifferent way. Hester was alone with the shop boy. Few people came in during the universal Monkshaven dinner hour. She was resting her head on her hand, and puzzled and distressed about many things, all that was implied by the proceedings of the evening before between Philip and Sylvia. And that was confirmed by Philip's miserable looks and strange abstracted ways to day. Oh, how easy Hester would have found it to make him happy! Not merely how easy, but what happiness it would have been to her to merge her every wish into the one great object of fulfilling his will. To her, an onlooker, the course of married life, which should lead to perfect happiness, seemed too plain. Alas, it is often so! And the resisting forces which make all such harmony and delight impossible are not recognized by the bystanders, hardly by the actors. But if these resisting forces are only superficial, or constitutional, they are but necessary discipline here, and do not radically affect the love which will make all things right in heaven. Some glimmering of this latter comforting truth shed its light on Hester's troubled thoughts from time to time. But again, how easy would it have been to her to tread the maze that led to Philip's happiness, and how difficult it seemed to the wife he had chosen. She was aroused by Dr. Morgan's voice. "So both Coulson and Hepburn had left the shop to your care, Hester. I want Hepburn, though. His wife is in a very anxious state. Where is he? Can you tell me?" "Sylvia in an anxious state! I've not seen her to day, but last night she looked as well as could be." "Ay, ay, but many a thing happens in 24 hours. Her mother is dying, may be dead by this time, and her husband should be there with her. Can't you send for him?" "I don't know where he is," said Hester. "He went off from here all on a sudden, when there was all the market folks in the shop. I thought he'd maybe gone to John Foster's about the money, for they was paying a deal in. I'll send there and inquire." No, the messenger brought back word that he had not been seen at their bank all morning. Further inquiries were made by the anxious Hester, by the doctor, by Coulson. All they could learn was that Phoebe had seen him pass the kitchen window about 11 o'clock, when she was peeling the potatoes for dinner. The two lads playing on the quay side thought they had seen him among a group of sailors, but these latter, as far as they could be identified, had no knowledge of his appearance among them. Before night the whole town was excited about his disappearance. Before night Belle Robson had gone to her long home. And Sylvia lay quiet and tearless, apparently more unmoved than any other creature by the events of the day, and the strange vanishing of her husband. The only thing she seemed to care for was her baby. She held it tight in her arms, and Dr. Morgan bade them leave it there. Its touch might draw the desired tears into her weary, sleepless eyes, and charm the aching pain out of them. They were afraid lest she should inquire for her husband, whose non-appearance at such a time of sorrow to his wife must, they thought, seem strange to her. And night drew on while they were all in this state. She had gone back to her own room without a word, when they had desired her to do so, caressing her child in her arms, and sitting down on the first chair she came to, with a heavy sigh, as if even this slight bodily exertion had been too much for her. They saw her eyes turn toward the door every time it was opened, and they thought it was with anxious expectation of one who could not be found, though many were seeking for him in all probable places. When night came some one had to tell her husband's disappearance, and Dr Morgan was the person who undertook this. He came into her room about 9 o'clock. Her baby was sleeping in her arms; she herself pale as death, still silent and tearless, though strangely watchful of gestures and sounds, and probably cognizant of more than they imagined. "Well, Mrs. Hepburn," said he, as cheerfully as he could, "I should advise your going to bed early, for I fancy your husband won't come home to night. Some journey or other, that perhaps Coulson can explain better than I can, will most likely keep him away till to morrow. It's very unfortunate that he should be away at such a sad time as this, as I'm sure he'll feel when he returns; but we must make the best of it." He watched her to see the effect of his words. She sighed, that was all. He still remained a little while. She lifted her head up a little and asked, "How long do you think she was unconscious, doctor? Could she hear things, think you, afore she fell into that strange kind of slumber?" "I cannot tell," said he, shaking his head. "Was she breathing in that hard snoring kind of way when you left her this morning?" "Yes, I think so. I cannot tell. So much has happened." "When you came back to her after your breakfast, I think you said she was in much the same position?" "Yes, and yet I may be telling you lies. If I could but think! But it's my head as is aching so, doctor. I wish you'd go, for I need being alone. I am so mazed." "Good night, then, for you are a wise woman, I see, and mean to go to bed and have a good night with baby there." But he went down to Phoebe, and told her to go in from time to time, and see how her mistress was. He found Hester Rose and the old servant together. Both had been crying; both were evidently in great trouble about the death and the mystery of the day. Hester asked if she might go up and see Sylvia, and the doctor gave his leave, talking meanwhile with Phoebe over the kitchen fire. Hester came down again without seeing Sylvia. The door of the room was bolted, and everything quiet inside. "Does she know where her husband is, think you?" asked the doctor at this account of Hester's. "She's not anxious about him at any rate, or else the shock of her mother's death had been too much for her. We must hope for some change in the morning. A good fit of crying, or a fidget about her husband, would be more natural. Good night to you both." And he went off. Phoebe and Hester avoided looking at each other at these words. Both were conscious of the probability of something having gone seriously wrong between the husband and wife. Hester had the recollection of the previous night, Phoebe the untasted breakfast of to-day to go upon. She spoke first. "I just wish he'd come home to still folks' tongues. It need never had been known if the old lady hadn't died this day of all others. It's such a thing for the shop to have one of the partners missing, and no one for to know what's comed on him. It never happened in Foster's days, that's all I know." "He'll maybe come back yet," said Hester. "It's not so very late." "It were market day and all," continued Phoebe. "Just as if everything mun go wrong together. And all the country customers will go back with fine tail in their mouths, as Master Hepburn was strayed and missing just like a beast of some kind." "Hark! Isn't that a step?" said Hester suddenly, as a footfall sounded in the now quiet street, but it passed the door, and the hope that had arisen on its approach fell as the sound died away. "He'll noane come to night," said Phoebe, who had been as eager a listener as Hester, however. "Thou'd best go thy ways home. I shall stay up, for it's not seemly for us all to go to our beds, and the corpse is in the house; and Nancy, as might ha' watched, is gone to her bed this hour past, like a lazy boots as she is. I can hear too if the master does come home, though I'll be bound he wunnot, Choose where he is, he'll be in bed by now, for it's well on to 11. I'll let thee out by the shop door, and stand by it till thou's close at home, for it's ill for a young woman to be in the street so late." So she held the door open, and shaded the candle from the flickering outer air, while Hester went to her home with a heavy heart. Heavily and hopelessly did they all meet in the morning. No news of Philip, no change in Sylvia. An unceasing flow of angling and conjecture and gossip radiating from the shop into the town. Hester could have entreated Coulson on her knees to cease from repeating the details of a story of which every word touched on a raw place in her sensitive heart. Moreover, when they talked together so eagerly, she could not hear the coming footsteps on the pavement without. Once some one hit very near the truth in a chance remark. "It seems strange," she said, "how as one man turns up, another just disappears. Why, it were but upon Tuesday as Kinraid come back, as all of his own folk had told he might be dead. And the next day here's Master Hepburn, as is gone no one knows where." "That's the way in this world," replied Coulson, a little sententiously. "This life is full of changes of one kind or another. Them that's dead is alive. And as for poor Philip, though he was alive, he looked fitter to be dead when he came into the shop of Wednesday morning." "And how does she take it?" nodding to where Sylvia was supposed to be. "Oh, she's not herself, so to say. She were just stunned by finding her mother was dying in her very arms, when she thought as she were only sleeping. Yet she's never been able to cry a drop. So that's the sorrows gone inwards on her brain, and from all I can hear, she doesn't rightly understand as her husband is missing. The doctor says if she could but cry, she'd come to a juster comprehension of things." "And what do John and Jeremiah Foster say to it all?" "They are down here many a time in the day to ask if he's come back, or how she is, for they made a deal on them both. They are going to attend the funeral to morrow, and have given orders as the shop is to be shut up in the morning." To the surprise of every one, Sylvia, who had never left her room since the night of her mother's death, and was supposed to be almost unconscious of all that was going on in the house, declared her intention of following her mother to the grave. No one could do more than remonstrate, no one had sufficient authority to interfere with her. Dr Morgan even thought that she might possibly be roused to tears by the occasion, only he begged Hester to go with her, that she might have the solace of some woman's company. She went through the greater part of the ceremony in the same hard, unmoved manner in which she had received everything for days past. But on looking up once, as they formed round the open grave, she saw Kester, in his Sunday clothes, with a bit of new crape round his hat, crying as if his heart would break over the coffin of his good, kind mistress. His evident distress, the unexpected sight, suddenly loosed the fountain of Sylvia's tears, and her sobs grew so terrible that Hester feared she would not be able to remain until the end of the funeral. But she struggled hard to stay till the last, and then she made an effort to go round by the place where Kester stood. "Come and see me," was all she could say for crying, and Kester only nodded his head. He could not speak a word. End of chapter 35.
Chapter 36 of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 36. Mysterious Tidings. That very evening Kester came, humbly knocking at the kitchen door. Phoebe opened it. He asked to see Sylvia. "I know not if she'll see thee," said Phoebe. "There's no making her out. Sometimes she's for one thing, sometimes she's for another." "She bid me come and see her," said Kester, "only this morning at Mrs. Berrien. She telled me to come." So Phoebe went off to inform Sylvia that Kester was there, and returned with the desire that he would walk into the parlour. An instant after he was gone, Phoebe heard him return, and carefully shut the 2 doors of communication between the kitchen and sitting room. Sylvia was in the latter when Hester came in, holding her baby close to her. Indeed, she seldom let it go nowadays to any one else, making Nancy's place quite a sinecure, much to Phoebe's indignation. Sylvia's face was shrunk and white and thin. Her lovely eyes alone retained the youthful, almost childlike expression. She went up to Hester and shook his horny hand, she herself trembling all over. "Don't talk to me of her," she said hastily. "I cannot stand it. It's a blessing for her to be gone, but oh!" She began to cry, and then cheered herself up and swallowed down her sobs. "Hester," she went on hastily, "Charlie Kinraid isn't dead. Dost ta know? He's alive, and he were here a Tuesday. No, Monday was it? I cannot tell, but he were here." "I knowed as he weren't dead. Every one is a speaking on it, but I didn't know as thee'd ha' seen him. I took comfort in thinking as thou ha' been with a mother at a time as he were in t' place." "Then he's gone," said Sylvia. "Gone! Ay, days past. As far as I know, he but stopped a neet. I thought to myself, but you may be sure I said nought to nobody. He's heerd as our Sylvia were married, and has put it in his pipe, and ta'en himself off to smoke it." "Hester," said Sylvia, leaning forwards and whispering, "I saw him. He was here. Philip saw him. Philip had known as he wasn't dead all this time." Hester stood up suddenly. "By gum! That chap has a deal to answer for." A bright red spot was on each of Sylvia's white cheeks, and for a minute or so neither of them spoke. Then she went on, still whispering out her words. "Hester, I'm more afeared than I dare tell any one. Can they ha' met, think yo'? T' very thought turns me sick. I told Philip my mind, and took a vow again him. But it would be awful to think on harm happening to him through Kinraid. Yet he went out that morning, and has never been seen or heard on sin, and Kinraid were just fell again him, and as for that matter, so was I, but—" The red spot vanished as she faced her own imagination. Hester spoke. "It's a thing as can be easily looked into. What day and time were it when Philip left this house?" "Tuesday, the day she died. I saw him in her room that morning between breakfast and dinner. I could a'most swear it to its being close after 11. I mind counting the clock. It was on that very morning as Kinraid were here." "I'll go and have a pint o' beer at t' King's Arms down on t' quayside. It were there he put up at, and I'm pretty sure as he only stopped one night, and left in t' morning betimes. But I'll go see." "Do," said Sylvia, "and go out through t' shop. They're all watching and watching me to see how I take things, and I daren't let on about a fire as is burning up my heart. Coulson is in t' shop, but he'll not notice thee like Phoebe." By and by Hester came back. It seemed as though Sylvia had never stirred. She looked eagerly at him, but did not speak. "He went away o' Rob Mason's mail cart, him as takes t' letters to Hartlepool. T' lieutenant, as they ca' him down at t' King's Arms, they're as proud o' his uniform as if it had been a new painted sign to swing o'er their doors. T' lieutenant had reckoned upon staying longer wi' 'em, but he went out betimes o' Tuesday morning, and came back a' ruffled up, and paid his bill, paid for his breakfast, though he touched noane on it, and went off i' Rob Postman's mail cart, as starts regular at 10 o'clock. Corneys had been there asking for him, and making a piece o' work, as he niver went near 'em, and they be's cousins. Niver a one among 'em knows as he were here as far as I could mak' out." "Thank you, Hester," said Sylvia, falling back into her chair, as if all the energy that had kept her stiff and upright was gone, now that her anxiety was relieved. She was silent for a long time, her eyes shut, her cheek laid on her child's head. Hester spoke next. "I think it's pretty clear as they niver met. But it's a' t' more wonder where thy husband's gone to. Thee and him had words about it, and thou telled him thy mind, thou said." "Yes," said Sylvia, not moving. "I'm afeared lest mother knows what I said to him. There, where she's gone to. I am—" The tears filled her shut eyes, and came softly overflowing down her cheeks. "And yet it were true what I said. I cannot forgive him. He's just spoilt my life. And I'm not 21 yet, and he knowed how wretched, how very wretched I were. A word fra' him would ha' mended it. And Charlie had bid him speak the word, and give me his faithful love, and Philip saw my heart ache day after day, and niver let on, as him I was mourning for was alive. and had sent me word as he'd keep true to me, as I were doing to him. I wish I'd been there. I'd ha' felled him to the ground, said Kester, clenching his stiff hard hand with indignation. Sylvia was silent again. Pale and weary she sate, her eyes still shut. Then she said, Yet he were so good to mother, and mother loved him so. Oh, Kester, lifting herself up, opening her great wistful eyes, it's well for folks as can die. They're spared a deal o' misery. Ay, said he, but there's folks as one 'ud like to keep fra shirking their misery. Think you now as Philip is living? Sylvia shivered all over and hesitated before she replied. I do not know. I said such things. He deserved 'em all. Well, well, lass, said Kester, sorry that he had asked the question which was producing so much emotion of one kind or another. Neither thee nor me can tell. We can neither help nor hinder, seeing as he's ta'en hisself off out of our sight. We'd best not think on him. I'll try and tell thee some news, if I can think on it with my mind so full. Thou knows Haytersbank folk have flitted, and t' oud place is empty. Yes, said Sylvia, with the indifference of one wearied out with feeling. I only telled ye to count like for me being at loose end in Monkshaven. My sister, her as lived at Dale End and is a widow, has comed into town to live, and I'm lodging wi' her, and jobbing about. I'm getting pretty well to do, and I'm noane far to seek, and I'm going now. Only first I just wanted for to say, as I'm thy oldest friend, I reckon, and if I can do a turn for thee, or go an errand, like as I've done to day, or if it's any comfort to talk a bit to one who's known thy life from a babby, why, you've only to send for me, and I'd come if it were 20 mile. I'm lodging at Peggy Dawson's, to Lath and Plaster College at t' right hand of Tribridge, a' among t' new houses, as they're thinking o' building near t' sea. No one can miss it. He stood up and shook hands with her. As he did so, he looked at her sleeping baby. She's liker you than him, I think I'll say. God bless her. With the heavy sound of his outgoing footsteps, baby awoke. She ought before this time to have been asleep in her bed, and the disturbance made her cry fretfully. Hush thee, darling, hush thee, murmured her mother. There's no one left to love me but thee, and I cannot stand thy weeping, my pretty one. Hush thee, my babe, hush thee. She whispered soft in the little one's ear as she took her upstairs to bed. About 3 weeks after the miserable date of Bell Robson's death, and Philip's disappearance, Hester Rose received a letter from him. She knew the writing on the address well, and it made her tremble so much that it was many minutes before she dared to open it, and make herself acquainted with the facts it might disclose. But she need not have feared. There were no facts told, unless the vague date of London might be something to learn. Even that much might have been found out by the postmark, only she had been too much taken by surprise to examine it. It ran as follows: Dear Hester, tell those to whom it may concern that I have left Monkshaven for ever. No one need trouble themselves about me. I am provided for. Please to make my humble apologies to my kind friends, the Messrs. Foster, and to my partner William Coulson. Please to accept of my love, and to join the same to your mother. Please give my particular and respectful duty and kind love to my aunt Isabella Robson. Her daughter Sylvia knows what I have always felt, and shall always feel, for her better than I can ever put into language. So I send her no message. God bless and keep my child. You must all look on me as one dead, as I am to you, and maybe shall soon be in reality. Your affectionate and obedient friend to command, Philip Hepburn. P.S. Oh, Hester, for God's sake and mine, look after my wife scratched out, Sylvia and my child. I think Jeremiah Foster will help you to be a friend to them. This is the last solemn request of P.H. She is but very young. Hester read this letter again and again, till her heart caught the echo of its hopelessness and sank within her. She put it in her pocket, and reflected upon it all the day long as she served in the shop. The customers found her as gentle, but far more inattentive than usual. She thought that in the evening she would go across the bridge and consult with the 2 good old brothers Foster, but something occurred to put off the fulfilment of this plan. That same morning Sylvia had preceded her, with no one to consult, because consultation would have required previous confidence, and confidence would have necessitated such a confession about Kinraid as it was most difficult for Sylvia to make. The poor young wife yet felt that some step must be taken by her, and what it was to be she could not imagine. She had no home to go to, for as Philip was gone away, she remained where she was only on sufferance. She did not know what means of livelihood she had. She was willing to work, nay, would be thankful to take up her old life of country labour, but with her baby what could she do? In this dilemma, the recollection of the old man's kindly speech and offer of assistance, made, it is true, half in joke, at the end of her wedding visit, came into her mind, and she resolved to go and ask for some of the friendly counsel and assistance then offered. It would be the first time of her going out since her mother's funeral, and she dreaded the effort on that account. More even than on that account did she shrink from going into the streets again. She could not get over the impression that Kinraid must be lingering near, and she distrusted herself so much that it was a positive terror to think of meeting him again. She felt as though, if she but caught a sight of him, the glitter of his uniform, or heard his well-known voice in only a distant syllable of talk, her heart would stop, and she should die from very fright of what would come next. Or rather, so she felt, and so she thought, before she took her baby in her arms, as Nancy gave it to her after putting on its out-of-door attire. With it in her arms she was protected, and the whole current of her thoughts was changed. The infant was wailing and suffering with its teething, and the mother's heart was so occupied in soothing and consoling her moaning child, that the dangerous quayside and the bridge were passed almost before she was aware. Nor did she notice the eager curiosity and respectful attention of those she met, who recognized her even through the heavy veil which formed part of the draping mourning provided for her by Hester and Coulson in the first unconscious days after her mother's death. Though public opinion as yet reserved its verdict upon Philip's disappearance, warned possibly by Kinraid's story against hasty decisions and judgments in such times as those of war and general disturbance, yet every one agreed that no more pitiful fate could have befallen Philip's wife. Marked out by her striking beauty as an object of admiring interest, even in those days when she sate in girlhood's smiling peace by her mother at the market cross, her father had lost his life in a popular cause, and ignominious as the manner of his death might be, he was looked upon as a martyr to his zeal in avenging the wrongs of his townsmen. Sylvia had married amongst them too, and her quiet daily life was well known to them, and now her husband had been carried off from her side just on the very day when she needed his comfort most. For the general opinion was that Philip had been carried off. In seaport towns such occurrences were not uncommon in those days, either by land crimps or water crimps. So Sylvia was treated with silent reverence, as one sorely afflicted, by all the unheeded people she met in her faltering walk to Jeremiah Foster's. She had calculated her time so as to fall in with him at his dinner hour, even though it obliged her to go to his own house rather than to the bank where he and his brother spent all the business hours of the day. Sylvia was so nearly exhausted by the length of her walk and the weight of her baby, that all she could do when the door was opened was to totter into the nearest seat, sit down, and begin to cry. In an instant kind hands were about her, loosening her heavy cloak, offering to relieve her of her child, who clung to her all the more firmly, and some one was pressing a glass of wine against her lips. "No, sir, I cannot take it. Wine allays gives me the headache. If I might have just a drink of water." "Thank you, ma'am," to the respectable looking old servant. "I'm well enough now, and perhaps, sir, I might speak a word with you, for it's that I've come for." "It's a pity, Sylvia Hepburn, as thee didst not come to me at the bank, for it's been a long toil for thee all this way in the heat with thy child. But if there's aught I can do or say for thee, thou hast but to name it, I am sure. Martha, wilt thou relieve her of her child while she comes with me into the parlour?" But the wilful little Bella stoutly refused to go to any one, and Sylvia was not willing to part with her, tired though she was. So the baby was carried into the parlour, and much of her after life depended on this trivial fact. Once installed in the easy chair, and face to face with Jeremiah, Sylvia did not know how to begin. Jeremiah saw this, and kindly gave her time to recover herself, by pulling out his great gold watch, and letting the seal dangle before the child's eyes, almost within reach of the child's eager little fingers. "She favours you a deal," said he at last. "More than her father," he went on, purposely introducing Philip's name so as to break the ice, for he rightly conjectured she had come to speak to him about something connected with her husband. Still Sylvia said nothing. She was choking down tears and shyness, and unwillingness to take as confidant a man of whom she knew so little, on such slight ground, as she now felt it to be, as the little kindly speech with which she had been dismissed from that house the last time she had entered it. "It's no use keeping you, sir," she broke out at last. "It's about Philip as I come to speak. Do you know anything whatsoever about him? He never had a chance of saying anything, I know, but maybe he's written?" "Not a line, my poor young woman," said Jeremiah, hastily putting an end to that vain idea. "Then he's either dead or gone away for iver," she whispered. "I mun be both feyther and mother to my child." "Oh, thee must not give it up," replied he. "Many a one is carried off to the wars, or to the tenders o' men o' war, and they turn out to be unfit for service, and are sent home. Philip'll come back before the year's out, thee'll see that." "No, he'll never come back; and I'm not sure as I should ever wish him to come back, if I could but know what was gone wi' him. Yo' see, sir, though I were sore set again' him, I shouldn't like harm to happen him." "There is something behind all this that I do not understand. Can thee tell me what it is?" "I must, sir, if you're to help me wi' your counsel, and I came up here to ask for it." Another long pause, during which Jeremiah made a feint of playing with the child, who danced and shouted with tantalized impatience at not being able to obtain possession of the seal, and at length stretched out her soft round little arms to go to the owner of the coveted possession. Surprise at this action roused Sylvia, and she made some comment upon it. "I niver knew her to go to any one afore. I hope she'll not be troublesome to you, sir." The old man, who had often longed for a child of his own in days gone by, was highly pleased by this mark of baby's confidence, and almost forgot, in trying to strengthen her regard by all the winning wiles in his power, how her poor mother was still lingering over some painful story which she could not bring herself to tell. "I'm afeared o' speaking wrong again' any one, sir, and mother was so fond o' Philip, but he kept something from me as would ha' made me a different woman, and some one else happen a different man. I were troth plighted wi' Kinraid the specksioneer, him as was cousin to the Corneys o' Mossbrow, and comed back lieutenant in t' navy last Tuesday 3 weeks, after ivery one had thought him dead and gone these 3 years." She paused. "Well?" said Jeremiah with interest, although his attention appeared to be divided between the mother's story and the eager playfulness of the baby on his knee. "Philip knew he were alive. He'd seen him taken by t' press gang, and Charlie had sent a message to me by Philip." Her white face was reddening, her eyes flashing at this point of her story. "And he niver told me a word on it, not when he saw me like to break my heart in thinking as Kinraid were dead. He kept it a' to himself, and watched me cry, and niver said a word to comfort me wi' t' truth. It would ha' been a great comfort, sir, only to have had his message, if I'd never ha' been to see him again. But Philip niver let on to any one, as I ever heerd on, that he'd seen Charlie that morning as t' press gang took him. You know about feyther's death, and how friendless mother and me was left, and so I married him, for he were a good friend to us then, and I were dazed like wi' sorrow, and could see nought else to do for mother. He were allays very tender and good to her, for sure." Again a long pause of silent recollection, broken by one or two deep sighs. "If I go on, sir, now, I mun ask you to promise as you'll never tell. I do so need some one to tell me what I ought to do, and I were led here like, else I would ha' died wi' it all within my teeth. You'll promise, sir?" Jeremiah Foster looked in her face, and seeing the wistful eager look, he was touched almost against his judgment into giving the promise required. She went on. "Upon a Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago, I think, though for t' matter o' time it might ha' been 3 years, Kinraid come back for to claim me as his wife, and I were wed to Philip. I met him in t' road at first, and I couldn't tell him theere. He followed me into t' house, Philip's house, sir, behind a shop, and somehow I told him all, how I were a wedded wife to another. Then he up and said I'd a false heart, me false, sir, as had eaten my daily bread in bitterness, and had wept o' nights through, all for sorrow and mourning for his death. Then he said as Philip knowed all t' time he were alive and coming back for me, and I couldn't believe it, and I called Philip, and he come, and all that Charlie had said were true, and yet I were Philip's wife. So I took a mighty oath, and I said as I'd never hold Philip to be my lawful husband again, nor iver forgive him for t' evil he wrought us, but hold him as a stranger, and one as had done me a heavy wrong." She stopped speaking, Her story seemed to her to end there, but her listener said, after a pause, "It were a cruel wrong, I grant thee that. But thy oath were a sin, and thy words were evil, my poor lass. What happened next?" "I don't justly remember," said she, wearily. "Kinraid went away, and mother cried out, and I went to her. She were asleep, I thought, so I lay down by her, to wish I were dead, and to think on what would come on my child if I died, and Philip came in softly, and I made as if I were asleep, and that's t' very last as I've ever seen or heerd of him." Jeremiah Foster groaned as she ended her story. Then he pulled himself up, and said in a cheerful tone of voice, "He'll come back, Sylvia Hepburn. He'll think better of it, never fear." "I fear his coming back," said she. "That's what I'm feared on. I would wish as I knew on his well doing in some other place, but him and me can niver live together again." "Nay," pleaded Jeremiah, "thee art sorry what thee said. Thee were sore put about, or thee wouldn't have said it." He was trying to be a peacemaker, and to heal over conjugal differences, but he did not go deep enough. "I'm not sorry," said she, slowly. "I were too deeply wronged to be put about. That would go off wi' a night's sleep. It's only the thought of mother, she's dead and happy, and knows nought of all this, I trust, that comes between me and hating Philip. I'm not sorry for what I said." Jeremiah had never met with any one so frank and undisguised in expressions of wrong feeling, and he scarcely knew what to say. He looked extremely grieved, and not a little shocked. So pretty and delicate a young creature to use such strong, relentless language. She seemed to read his thoughts, for she made answer to them. "I dare say you think I'm very wicked, sir, not to be sorry. Perhaps I am. I can't think o' that, for remembering how I've suffered. And he knew how miserable I was, and might ha' cleared my misery away wi' a word, and he held his peace, and now it's too late. I'm sick o' men and their cruel, deceitful ways. I wish I were dead." She was crying before she had ended this speech, and seeing her tears, the child began to cry too, stretching out its little arms to go back to its mother. The hard stony look on her face melted away into the softest, tenderest love as she clasped the little one to her, and tried to soothe its frightened sobs. A bright thought came into the old man's mind. He had been taking a complete dislike to her, till her pretty way with her baby showed him that she had a heart of flesh within her. "Poor little one," said he, "thy mother had need love thee, for she's deprived thee of thy father's love. Thou'rt half way to being an orphan, yet I cannot call thee one of the fatherless to whom God will be a father. Thou'rt a desolate baby, thou mayst well cry, thine earthly parents have forsaken thee, and I know not if the Lord will take thee up." Sylvia looked up at him affrighted. Holding her baby tighter to her, she exclaimed, "Don't speak so, sir! It's cursing, sir! I haven't forsaken her. Oh, sir, those are awful sayings. Thee hast sworn never to forgive thy husband, nor to live with him again. Dost thee know that by the law of the land he may claim his child, and then thou wilt have to forsake it, or to be forsworn? Poor little maiden," continued he, once more luring the baby to him with the temptation of the watch and chain. Sylvia thought for a while before speaking. Then she said, "I cannot tell what ways to take. Whilst I think my head is crazed. It were a cruel turn he did me." "It was. I couldn't have thought him guilty of such baseness." This acquiescence, which was perfectly honest on Jeremiah's part, almost took Sylvia by surprise. Why might she not hate one who had been both cruel and base in his treatment of her? And yet she recoiled from the application of such hard terms by another to Philip, by a cool judging and indifferent person, as she esteemed Jeremiah to be. From some inscrutable turn in her thoughts, she began to defend him, or at least to palliate the harsh judgment which she herself had been the first to pronounce. "He were so tender to mother. She were dearly fond on him. He never spared aught he could do for her, else I would never ha' married him. He was a good and kind-hearted lad from the time he was 15, and I never found him out in any falsehood, no more did my brother." "But it were all the same as a lie," said Sylvia, swiftly changing her ground, "to leave me to think as Charlie were dead, when he knowed all t' time he were alive." "It was a self-seeking lie, putting thee to pain to get his own ends; and the end of it has been that he is driven forth like Cain." "I niver told him to go, sir." "But thy words sent him forth, Sylvia." I cannot unsay them, sir, and I believe as I should say them again.' But she said this as one who rather hopes for a contradiction. All Jeremiah replied, however, was, 'Poor wee child,' in a pitiful tone addressed to the baby. Sylvia's eyes filled with tears. 'Oh, sir, I'll do anything as ever you can tell me for her. That's what I came for to ask you. I know I mun not stay there, and Philip gone away, and I dunnot know what to do, and I'll do aught, only I must keep her with me. Whativer can I do, sir?' Jeremiah thought it over for a minute or two. Then he replied, 'I must have time to think. I must talk it over with brother John.' 'But you've given me your word, sir,' exclaimed she. 'I have given thee my word never to tell any one of what has passed between thee and thy husband. But I must take counsel with my brother as to what is to be done with thee and thy child, now that thy husband has left the shop.' This was said so gravely as almost to be a reproach, and he got up, as a sign that the interview was ended. He gave the baby back to its mother, but not without a solemn blessing, so solemn that, to Sylvia's superstitious and excited mind, it undid the terrors of what she had esteemed to be a curse. 'The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face to shine upon thee.' All the way down the hillside Sylvia kept kissing the child, and whispering to its unconscious ears, 'I'll love thee for both, my treasure, I will. I'll hap thee round wi' my love, so as thou shall never need a feyther's.' End of chapter 36.
Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Mackenzie. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 37. Bereavement. Hester had been prevented by her mother's indisposition from taking Philip's letter to the Fosters to hold a consultation with them over its contents. Alice Rose was slowly failing, and the long days which she had to spend alone told much upon her spirits, and consequently upon her health. All this came out in the conversation which ensued after reading Hepburn's letter in the little parlour at the bank on the day after Sylvia had had her confidential interview with Jeremiah Foster. He was a true man of honour, and had never so much as alluded to her visit to him. But what she had then told him influenced him very much in the formation of the project which he proposed to his brother and Hester. He recommended her remaining where she was, living still in the house behind the shop, for he thought within himself that she might have exaggerated the effect of her words upon Philip, that, after all, it might have been some cause totally disconnected with them which had blotted out her husband's place among the men of Monkshaven, and that it would be so much easier for both to resume their natural relations, both towards each other and towards the world, if Sylvia remained where her husband had left her, in an expectant attitude, so to speak. Jeremiah Foster questioned Hester straightly about her letter, whether she had made known its contents to any one. No, not to any one. Neither to her mother, nor to William Coulson? No, to neither. She looked at him as she replied to his inquiries, and he looked at her, each wondering if the other could be in the least aware that a conjugal quarrel might be at the root of the dilemma in which they were placed by Hepburn's disappearance. But neither Hester, who had witnessed the misunderstanding between the husband and wife on the evening before the morning on which Philip went away, nor Jeremiah Foster, who had learned from Sylvia the true reason of her husband's disappearance, gave the slightest reason to the other to think that they each supposed they had a clue to the reason of Hepburn's sudden departure. What Jeremiah Foster, after a night's consideration, had to propose was this: that Hester and her mother should come and occupy the house in the market place, conjointly with Sylvia and her child. Hester's interest in the shop was by this time acknowledged. Jeremiah had made over to her so much of his share in the business that she had a right to be considered as a kind of partner, and she had long been the superintendent of that department of goods which were exclusively devoted to women. So her daily presence was requisite for more reasons than one. Yet her mother's health and spirits were such as to render it unadvisable that the old woman should be too much left alone, and Sylvia's devotion to her own mother seemed to point her out as the very person who could be a gentle and tender companion to Alice Rose during those hours when her own daughter would necessarily be engaged in the shop. Many desirable objects seemed to be gained by this removal of Alice. An occupation was provided for Sylvia, which would detain her in the place where her husband had left her, and where, Jeremiah Foster fairly expected in spite of his letter, he was likely to come back to find her. And Alice Rose, the early love of one of the brothers, the old friend of the other, would be well cared for, and under her daughter's immediate supervision during the whole of the time that she was occupied in the shop. Philip's share of the business, augmented by the money which he had put in from the legacy of his old Cumberland uncle, would bring in profits enough to support Sylvia and her child in ease and comfort until that time, which they all anticipated, when he should return from his mysterious wandering, mysterious whether his going forth had been voluntary or involuntary. Thus far was settled, and Jeremiah Foster went to tell Sylvia of the plan. She was too much a child, too entirely unaccustomed to any independence of action, to do anything but leave herself in his hands. Her very confession, made to him the day before, when she sought his counsel, seemed to place her at his disposal. Otherwise, she had had notions of the possibility of a free country life once more. How provided for and arranged she hardly knew, but Haytersbank was to let, and Kester disengaged, and it had just seemed possible that she might have to return to her early home and to her old life. She knew that it would take much money to stock the farm again, and that her hands were tied from much useful activity by the love and care she owed to her baby. But still, somehow, she hoped and she fancied, till Jeremiah Foster's measured words and carefully arranged plan made her silently relinquish her green breezy vision. Hester, too, had her own private rebellion, hushed into submission by her gentle piety. If Sylvia had been able to make Philip happy, Hester could have felt lovingly and almost gratefully towards her, but Sylvia had failed in this. Philip had been made unhappy, and was driven forth a wanderer into the wide world, never to come back; and his last words to Hester, the postscript of his letter, containing the very pith of it, was to ask her to take charge and care of the wife whose want of love towards him had uprooted him from the place where he was valued and honoured. It cost Hester many a struggle and many a self-reproach before she could make herself feel what she saw all along, that in everything Philip treated her like a sister. But even a sister might well be indignant if she saw her brother's love disregarded and slighted, and his life embittered by the thoughtless conduct of a wife. Still Hester fought against herself, and for Philip's sake she sought to see the good in Sylvia, and she strove to love her as well as to take care of her. With the baby, of course, the case was different. Without thought or struggle or reason, every one loved the little girl. Coulson and his buxom wife, who were childless, were never weary of making much of her. Hester's happiest hours were spent with that little child. Jeremiah Foster almost looked upon her as his own from the day when she honoured him by yielding to the temptation of the chain and seal, and coming to his knee, not a customer to the shop but knew the smiling child's sad history, and many a countrywoman would save a rosy-cheeked apple from out her store that autumn to bring it on next market day for Philip Hepburn's baby as had lost its father, bless it. Even stern Alice Rose was graciously inclined towards the little Bella, and though her idea of the number of the elect was growing narrower and narrower every day, she would have been loath to exclude the innocent little child that stroked her wrinkled cheek so softly every night in return for her blessing, from the few that should be saved. Nay, for the child's sake she relented towards the mother, and strove to have Sylvia rescued from the many castaways with fervent prayer, or as she phrased it, wrestling with the Lord. Alice had a sort of instinct that the little child, so tenderly loved by, so fondly loving, the mother whose ewe lamb she was, could not be even in heaven without yearning for the creature she had loved best on earth; and the old woman believed that this was the principal reason for her prayers for Sylvia; but, unconsciously to herself, Alice Rose was touched by the filial attentions she constantly received from the young mother, whom she believed to be foredoomed to condemnation. Sylvia rarely went to church or chapel, nor did she read her Bible; for though she spoke little of her ignorance, she would fain, for her child's sake, have remedied it now it was too late. She had lost what little fluency of reading she had ever had, and could only make out her words with much spelling and difficulty. So the taking her Bible in hand would have been a mere form, though of this Alice Rose knew nothing. No one knew much of what was passing in Sylvia; she did not know herself. Sometimes in the night she would waken crying with a terrible sense of desolation. Every one who loved her, or whom she had loved, had vanished out of her life; every one but her child, who lay in her arms warm and soft. But then Jeremiah Foster's words came upon her, words that she had taken for cursing at the time, and she would so gladly have had some clue by which to penetrate the darkness of the unknown region from whence both blessing and cursing came, and to know if she had indeed done something which should cause her sin to be visited on that soft, sweet, innocent darling. If any one would teach her to read! If any one would explain to her the hard words she heard in church or chapel, so that she might find out the meaning of sin and godliness! Words that she had only passed over the surface of her mind till now. For her child's sake, she should like to do the will of God, if she only knew what that was, and how to be worked out in her daily life. But there was no one she dared confess her ignorance to and ask information from. Jeremiah Foster had spoken as if her child, sweet little merry Bella, with a loving word and a kiss for every one, was to suffer heavily for the just and true words her wronged and indignant mother had spoken. Alice always spoke as if there were no hope for her, and blamed her, nevertheless, for not using the means of grace that it was not in her power to avail herself of. And Hester, that Sylvia would fain have loved for her uniform gentleness and patience with all around her, seemed so cold in her unruffled and undemonstrative behaviour; and moreover, Sylvia felt that Hester blamed her perpetual silence regarding Philip's absence, without knowing how bitter a cause Sylvia had for casting him off. The only person who seemed to have pity upon her was Kester, and his pity was shown in looks rather than words, for when he came to see her, which he did from time to time, by a kind of mutual tacit consent, they spoke but little of former days. He was still lodging with his sister, widow Dobson, working at odd jobs, some of which took him into the country for weeks at a time; but on his returns to Monkshaven he was sure to come and see her and the little Bella. Indeed, when his employment was in the immediate neighbourhood of the town, he never allowed a week to pass away without a visit. There was not much conversation between him and Sylvia at such times. They skimmed over the surface of the small events in which both took an interest. Only now and then a sudden glance, a checked speech, told each that there were deeps not forgotten, although they were never mentioned. Twice Sylvia, below her breath, had asked Kester, just as she was holding the door open for his departure, if anything had ever been heard of Kinraid since his one night's visit to Monkshaven. Each time, and there was an interval of some months between the inquiries, the answer had been simply no. To no one else would Sylvia ever have named his name. But indeed she had not the chance, had she wished it ever so much, of asking any questions about him from any one likely to know. The Corneys had left Moss Brow at Martinmas, and gone many miles away towards Horncastle. Bessy Corney, it is true, was married, and left behind in the neighbourhood. Bessy Corney, it is true, was married and left behind in the neighbourhood, but with her Sylvia had never been intimate, and what girlish friendship there might have been between them had cooled very much at the time of Kinraid's supposed death 3 years before. One day before Christmas in this year, 1798, Sylvia was called into the shop by Coulson, who, with his assistant, was busy undoing the bales of winter goods supplied to them from the West Riding and other places. He was looking at a fine Irish poplin dress piece when Sylvia answered to his call. "Here, do you know this again?" asked he, in the cheerful tone of one sure of giving pleasure. "No, have I ever seen it afore?" "Not this, but one for all t' world like it." She did not rouse up to much interest, but looked at it as if trying to recollect where she could have seen its like. "My missus had one on at party at John Foster's last March, and she admired it a deal; and Philip, he thought of nothing but how he could get you just such another, and he said to vast o' folk agate it for to meet wi' marrow, and what he did just the very day afore he went away so mysterious was to write through Dawson Brothers o' Wakefield to Dublin and order that one should be woven for you. Jemima had to cut a bit off hers for to give 'em t' exact colour." Sylvia did not say anything but that it was very pretty, in a low voice, and then she quickly left the shop, much to Coulson's displeasure. All the afternoon she was unusually quiet and depressed. Alice Rose, sitting helpless in her chair, watched her with keen eyes. At length, after one of Sylvia's deep unconscious sighs, the old woman spoke. "It's religion as must comfort thee, child, as it's done many a one afore thee." "How?" said Sylvia, looking up, startled to find herself an object of notice. "How?" The answer was not quite so ready as the precept had been. "Read the Bible, and thou wilt learn." "But I cannot read," said Sylvia, too desperate any longer to conceal her ignorance. "Not read? And thee Philip's wife as was such a great scholar! Of a surety the ways of this life are crooked. There was our Hester, as can read as well as any minister, and Philip passes over her to go and choose a young lass as cannot read a Bible." Was Philip and Hester... Sylvia paused, for though a new curiosity had dawned upon her, she did not know how to word her question. "Many a time and oft have I seen Hester take comfort in her Bible when Philip was following after thee. She knew where to go for consolation." "I'd fain read," said Sylvia, humbly, "if anybody would learn me, for perhaps it might do me good. I'm noane so happy." Her eyes, as she looked up to Alice's stern countenance, were full of tears. The old woman saw it and was touched, although she did not immediately show her sympathy; but she took her own time, and made no reply. The next day, however, she bade Sylvia come to her, and then and there, as if her pupil had been a little child, she began to teach Sylvia to read the first chapter of Genesis; for all other reading but the Scriptures was as vanity to her, and she would not condescend to the weakness of other books. Sylvia was now, as ever, slow at book learning, but she was meek and desirous to be taught, and her willingness in this respect pleased Alice, and drew her singularly towards one who, from being a pupil, might become a convert. At this time Sylvia never lost the curiosity that had been excited by the few words Alice had let drop about Hester and Philip, and by degrees she approached the subject again, and had the idea then started confirmed by Alice, who had no scruple in using the past experience of her own, of her daughter's, or of any one's life, as an instrument to prove the vanity of setting the heart on anything earthly. This knowledge, unsuspected before, sank deep into Sylvia's thoughts, and gave her a strange interest in Hester. Poor Hester, whose life she had so crossed and blighted, even by the very blighting of her own. She gave Hester her own form of passionate feelings for Kinraid, and wondered how she herself should have felt towards any one who had come between her and him, and willed his love away. When she remembered Hester's unfailing sweetness and kindness towards herself from the very first, she could better bear the comparative coldness of her present behaviour. She tried, indeed, hard to win back the favour she had lost, but the very means she took were blunders, and only made it seem to her as if she could never again do right in Hester's eyes. For instance, she begged her to accept and wear the pretty poplin gown which had been Philip's especial choice, feeling within herself as if she should never wish to put it on, and as if the best thing she could do with it was to offer it to Hester. But Hester rejected the proffered gift with as much hardness of manner as she was capable of assuming, and Sylvia had to carry it upstairs and lay it by for the little daughter, who, Hester said, might perhaps learn to value things that her father had given a special thought to. Yet Sylvia went on trying to win Hester to like her once more. It was one of her great labours, and learning to read from Hester's mother was another. Alice, indeed, in her solemn way, was becoming quite fond of Sylvia. If she could not read or write, she had a deftness and gentleness of motion, a capacity for the household matters which fell into her department, that had a great effect on the old woman, and for her dear mother's sake Sylvia had a stock of patient love ready in her heart for all the aged and infirm that fell in her way. She never thought of seeking them out, as she knew that Hester did, but then she looked up to Hester as some one very remarkable for her goodness. If only she could have liked her! Hester tried to do all she could for Sylvia. Philip had told her to take care of his wife and child, but she had the conviction that Sylvia had so materially failed in her duties as to have made her husband an exile from his home, a penniless wanderer, wifeless and childless in some strange country whose very aspect was friendless, while the cause of all lived on in the comfortable home where he had placed her, wanting for nothing, an object of interest and regard to many friends, with a lovely little child to give her joy for the present and hope for the future, while he, the poor outcast, might even lie dead by the wayside. How could Hester love Sylvia? Yet they were frequent companions that ensuing spring. Hester was not well, and the doctors said that the constant occupation in the shop was too much for her, and that she must, for a time at least, take daily walks into the country. Sylvia used to beg to accompany her. She and the little girl often went with Hester up the valley of the river to some of the nestling farms that were hidden in the more sheltered nooks, for Hester was bidden to drink milk warm from the cow, and to go into the familiar haunts about a farm was one of the few things in which Sylvia seemed to take much pleasure. She would let little Bella toddle about while Hester sat and rested, and she herself would beg to milk the cow destined to give the invalid her draught. One May evening the three had been out on some such expedition. The countryside still looked grey and bare, though the leaves were showing on the willow and blackthorn and sloe, and by the tinkling runnels making hidden music along the copside, the pale delicate primrose buds were showing amid their fresh green crinkled leaves. The larks had been singing all the afternoon, but were now dropping down into the nests in the pasture fields. The air had just the sharpness in it which goes along with a cloudless evening sky at that time of the year. But Hester walked homeward slowly and languidly, speaking no word. Sylvia noticed this at first without venturing to speak, for Hester was one who disliked having her ailments noticed. But after a while Hester stood still in a sort of weary, dreamy abstraction, and Sylvia said to her, "I'm afeard you're sadly tired. Maybe we've been too far." Hester almost started. "No," said she, "it's only my headache which is worse to-night. It's been bad all day, but since I came out it's felt just as if there were great guns booming, till I could almost pray 'em to be quiet, I'm so weary of the sound." She stepped out quickly towards home after she had said this, as if she wished for neither pity nor comment on what she had said. Chapter 37.
Of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shushan. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 38. The Recognition. Far away, over sea and land, over sunny sea again, great guns were booming on that 7th of May, 1799. The Mediterranean came up with a long roar on a beach glittering white with snowy sand and the fragments of innumerable sea-shells, delicate and shining as porcelain. Looking at that shore from the sea, a long ridge of upland ground, beginning from an inland depth, stretched far away into the ocean on the right, till it ended in a great mountainous bluff, crowned with the white buildings of a convent, sloping rapidly down into the blue water at its base. In the clear eastern air, the different characters of the foliage that clothed the sides of that sea-washed mountain might be discerned from a long distance by the naked eye. The silver grey of the olive trees near its summit, the heavy green and bossy forms of the sycamores lower down, broken here and there by a solitary terebinth or ilex tree, of a deeper green and a wider spread, till the eye fell below on the maritime plain, edged with the white seaboard and the sandy hillocks, with here and there feathery palm trees, either isolated or in groups, motionless and distinct against the hot purple air. Look again. A little to the left on the seashore there are the white walls of a fortified town, glittering in sunlight, or black in shadow. The fortifications themselves run out into the sea, forming a port and a haven against the wild Levantine storms, and a lighthouse rises out of the waves to guide mariners into safety. Beyond this walled city, and far away to the left still, there is the same wide plain shut in by the distant rising ground, till the upland circuit comes closing in to the north, and the great white rocks meet the deep tideless ocean with its intensity of blue colour. Above, the sky is literally purple with heat, and the pitiless light smites the gazer's weary eye as it comes back from the white shore. Nor does the plain country in that land offer the refuge and rest of our own soft green. The limestone rock underlies the vegetation, and gives a glittering ashen hue to all the bare patches, and even to the cultivated parts which are burnt up early in the year. In springtime alone does the country look rich and fruitful. Then the cornfields of the plain show their capability of bearing, some 50, some an 100-fold. Down by the brook Kishon, flowing not far from the base of the mountainous promontory to the south, there grow the broad green fig trees, cool and fresh to look upon. The orchards are full of glossy-leaved cherry trees. The tall amaryllis puts forth crimson and yellow glories in the fields, rivaling the pomp of King Solomon. The daisies and the hyacinths spread their myriad flowers. The anemones, scarlet as blood, run hither and thither over the ground like dazzling flames of fire. A spicy odor lingers in the heated air. It comes from the multitude of aromatic flowers that blossom in the early spring. Later on they will have withered and faded, and the corn will have been gathered, and the deep green of the eastern foliage will have assumed a kind of grey-bleached tint. Even now in May, the hot sparkle of the everlasting sea, the terribly clear outline of all objects, whether near or distant, the fierce sun right overhead, the dazzling air around, were inexpressibly wearying to the English eyes that kept their skilled watch, day and night, on the strongly fortified coast town that lay out a little to the northward of where the British ships were anchored. They had kept up a flanking fire for many days in aid of those besieged in Saint-Jean-de-Acre, and at intervals had listened, impatient, to the sound of the heavy siege guns, or the sharper rattle of the French musketry. In the morning, on the 7th of May, a man at the masthead of the Tigre sang out that he saw ships in the offing, and in reply to the signal that was hastily run up, he saw the distant vessels hoist friendly flags. That May morning was a busy time. The besieged Turks took heart of grace. The French outside, under the command of their great general, made hasty preparations for a more vigorous assault than all many, both vigorous and bloody, that had gone before, for the siege was now at its 51st day, in hopes of carrying the town by storm before the reinforcement coming by sea could arrive. And Sir Sidney Smith, aware of Bonaparte's desperate intention, ordered all the men, both sailors and marines, that could be spared from the necessity of keeping up a continual flanking fire from the ships upon the French, to land, and assist the Turks and the British forces already there in the defence of the old historic city. Lieutenant Kinraid, who had shared his captain's daring adventure off the coast of France 3 years before, who had been a prisoner with him and Wesley Wright in the Temple at Paris, and had escaped with them, and through Sir Sidney's earnest recommendation, been promoted from being a warrant officer to the rank of lieutenant, received on this day the honour from his admiral of being appointed to an especial post of danger. His heart was like a war-horse, and said, "Ha, ha!" as the boat bounded over the waves that were to land him under the ancient machicolated walls where the Crusaders made their last stand in the Holy Land. Not that Kinraid knew or cared one jot about those gallant knights of old. All he knew was that the French, under Boney, were trying to take the town from the Turks, and that his admiral said they must not, and so they should not. He and his men landed on that sandy shore, and entered the town by the Waterport gate. He was singing to himself his own country song. "Will may the keel row, and his men, with sailors' aptitude for music, caught up the air, and joined in the burden with inarticulate sounds. So, with merry hearts, they threaded the narrow streets of Acre, hemmed in on either side by the white walls of Turkish houses, with small grated openings high up, above all chance of peeping intrusion. Here and there they met an ample-robed and turbaned Turk going along with as much haste as his stately self-possession would allow. But the majority of the male inhabitants were gathered together to defend the breach, where the French guns thundered out far above the heads of the sailors. They went along none the less merrily for the sound to Djezzar Pasha's garden, where the old Turk sat on his carpet beneath the shade of a great terebinth tree, listening to the interpreter, who made known to him the meaning of the eager speeches of Sir Sidney Smith and the colonel of the marines. As soon as the admiral saw the gallant sailors of HMS Tigre, he interrupted the council of war without much ceremony, and going to Kinraid, he dispatched them, as before arranged, to the North Ravelin, showing them the way with rapid, clear directions. Out of respect to him, they had kept silent while in the strange, desolate garden. But once more in the streets, the old Newcastle song rose up again, till the men were, perforce, silenced by the haste with which they went to the post of danger. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. For many a day these very men had been swearing at the terrific heat at this hour, even when at sea, fanned by the soft breeze. But now, in the midst of hot smoke, with former carnage tainting the air, and with the rush and whiz of death perpetually whistling in their ears, they were uncomplaining and light-hearted. Many an old joke and some new ones came brave and hearty on their cheerful voices, even though the speaker was veiled from sight in great clouds of smoke, cloven only by the bright flames of death. A sudden message came, as many of the crew of the Tigre as were under Lieutenant Kinraid's command were to go down to the mole, to assist the new reinforcements, seen by the sailor from the masthead at day-dawn, under command of Hassan Bey, to land at the mole, where Sir Sidney then was. Off they went, almost as bright and thoughtless as before, though 2 of their number lay silent for ever at the North Ravelin, silenced in that one little half-hour. And one went along with the rest, swearing lustily at his ill luck in having his right arm broken, but ready to do good business with his left. They helped the Turkish troops to land more with good will than tenderness, and then, led by Sir Sidney, they went under the shelter of English guns to the fatal breach, so often assailed, so gallantly defended, but never so fiercely contested as on this burning afternoon. The ruins of the massive wall that here had been broken down by the French were used by them as stepping-stones to get on a level with the besieged, and so to escape the heavy stones which the latter hurled down. Nay, even the dead bodies of the morning's comrades were made into ghastly stairs. When Djezzar Pasha heard that the British sailors were defending the breach, headed by Sir Sidney Smith, he left his station in the palace garden, gathered up his robes in haste, and hurried to the breach, where, with his own hands and with right hearty good will, he pulled the sailors down from the post of danger, saying that if he lost his English friends, he lost all. But little recked the crew of the Tigre of the one old man, Pasha or otherwise, who tried to hold them back from the fight. They were up and at the French assailants clambering over the breach in an instant, and so they went on as if it were some game at play instead of a deadly combat, until Kinraid and his men were called off by Sir Sidney, as the reinforcement of Turkish troops under Hassan Bey were now sufficient for the defence of that old breach in the walls, which was no longer the principal object of the French attack, for the besiegers had made a new and more formidable breach by their incessant fire, knocking down whole streets of the city walls. "Fight your best, Kinraid," said Sir Sidney, "for there's Boney on yonder hill looking at you." And sure enough, on a rising ground, called Richard Coeur de Lion's Mount, there was a half-circle of French generals on horseback, all deferentially attending to the motions, and apparently to the words of a little man in their centre, at whose bidding the aide-de-camp galloped swift with messages to the more distant French camp. The 2 ravelins which Kinraid and his men had to occupy, for the purpose of sending a flanking fire upon the enemy, were not 10 yards from that enemy's van. But at length there was a sudden rush of the French to that part of the wall where they imagined they could enter unopposed. Surprised at this movement, Kinraid ventured out of the shelter of the ravelin to ascertain the cause. He, safe and untouched during that long afternoon of carnage, fell now under a stray musket shot, and lay helpless and exposed upon the ground undiscerned by his men, who were recalled to help in the hot reception which had been planned for the French, who, descending the city walls into the Pasha's garden, were attacked with sabre and dagger, and lay headless corpses under the flowering rose-bushes and by the fountain side. Kinraid lay beyond the ravelins, many yards outside the city walls. He was utterly helpless, for the shot had broken his leg. Dead bodies of Frenchmen lay strewn around him. No Englishman had ventured out so far. All the wounded men that he could see were French, and many of these, furious with pain, gnashed their teeth at him and cursed him aloud, till he thought that his best course was to assume the semblance of death. For some among these men were still capable of dragging themselves up to him, and by concentrating all their failing energies into one blow, put him to a speedy end. The outlying pickets of the French army were within easy rifle shot, and his uniform, although less conspicuous in colour than that of the Marines by whose sides he had been fighting, would make him a sure mark if he so much as moved his arm. Yet how he longed to turn, if ever so slightly, so that the cruel slanting sun might not beat full into his aching eyes. Fever, too, was coming upon him. The pain in his leg was every moment growing more severe. The terrible thirst of the wounded, added to the heat and fatigue of the day, made his lips and tongue feel baked and dry, and his whole throat seemed parched and wooden. Thoughts of other days, of cool Greenland seas, where ice abounded, of grassy English homes, began to make the past more real than the present. With a great effort he brought his wandering senses back. He knew where he was now, and could weigh the chances of his life, which were but small. The unwonted tears came to his eyes as he thought of the newly made wife in her English home, who might never know how he died thinking of her. Suddenly he saw a party of English marines advance under shelter of the ravelin to pick up the wounded and bear them within the walls for surgical help. They were so near he could see their faces, could hear them speak, yet he durst not make any sign to them when he lay within range of the French pickets' fire. For one moment he could not resist raising his head to give himself a chance for life, before the unclean creatures that infest a camp came round in the darkness of the night to strip and insult the dead bodies, and to put to death such as had yet the breath of life within them. But the setting sun came full into his face, and he saw nothing of what he longed to see. He fell back in despair. He lay there to die. That strong, clear sunbeam had wrought his salvation. He had been recognized as men are recognized when they stand in the red glare of a house on fire. The same despair of help, of hopeless farewell to life, stamped on their faces in blood-red light. One man left his fellows and came running forwards in among the enemy's wounded, within range of their guns. He bent down over Kinraid. He seemed to understand without a word. He lifted him up, carrying him like a child, and with the vehement energy that is more from the force of will than the strength of body, he bore him back to within the shelter of the ravelin, not without many shots being aimed at them, one of which hit Kinraid in the fleshy part of his arm. Kinraid was racked with agony from his dangling broken leg, and his very life seemed leaving him. Yet he remembered afterwards how the marine recalled his fellows, and how, in the pause before they returned, his face became like one formerly known to the sixth senses of Kinraid. Yet it was too like a dream, too utterly improbable to be real. Yet the few words this man said as he stood breathless and alone by the fainting Kinraid fitted in well with the belief conjured up by his personal appearance. He panted out, "I never thought you'd have kept true to her." And then the others came up, and while they were making a sling of their belts, Kinraid fainted utterly away, and the next time that he was fully conscious, he was lying in his berth in the Tigre, with the ship's surgeon setting his leg. After that he was too feverish for several days to collect his senses. When he could first remember and form a judgment upon his recollections, he called the man especially charged to attend upon him, and bade him go and make inquiry in every possible manner for a marine named Philip Hepburn, and when he was found, to entreat him to come and see Kinraid. The sailor was away the greater part of the day, and returned unsuccessful in his search. He had been from ship to ship, hither and thither. He had questioned all the marines he had met with. No one knew anything of any Philip Hepburn. Kinraid passed a miserably feverish night, and when the doctor exclaimed the next morning at his retrogression, he told him, with some irritation, of the ill success of his servant. He accused the man of stupidity, and wished fervently that he were able to go himself. Partly to soothe him, the doctor promised that he would undertake the search for Hepburn, and he engaged faithfully to follow all Kinraid's eager directions, not to be satisfied with men's careless words, but to look over muster rolls and ship's books. He, too, brought the same answer, however unwillingly given. He had set out upon the search so confident of success that he felt doubly discomfited by failure. However, he had persuaded himself that the lieutenant had been partially delirious from the effects of his wound, and the power of the sun shining down just where he lay. There had indeed been slight symptoms of Kinraid's having received a sunstroke, and the doctor dwelt largely on these in his endeavour to persuade his patient that it was his imagination which had endued a stranger with the lineaments of some former friend. Kinraid threw his arms out of bed with impatience at all this plausible talk, which was even more irritating than the fact that Hepburn was still undiscovered. "The man was no friend of mine. I was like to have killed him when last I saw him. He was a shopkeeper in a country town in England. I had seen little enough of him, but enough to make me able to swear to him anywhere, even in a marine's uniform, and in this sweltering country." "Faces once seen, especially in excitement, are apt to return upon the memory in cases of fever," quoth the doctor sententiously. The attendant sailor, reinstalled to some complacency by the failure of another in the search in which he himself had been unsuccessful, now put in his explanation. "Maybe it was a spirit. It's not the first time as I've heard of a spirit coming upon earth to save a man's life in time of need. My father had an uncle, a West Country grazier, who was a coming over Dartmoor and Devonshire one moonlight night with a power of money as he'd got for his sheep at a fair. It were stored in leather bags under the seat of the gig. It were a rough kind of road, both as a road and in character, for there'd been many robberies there of late, and the great rocks stood convenient for hiding places. All at once father's uncle feels as if someone was sitting beside him on the empty seat, and he turns his head and looks, and there he sees his brother sitting. His brother, as had been dead 12 year and more. So he turns his head back again, eyes right, and never say a word, but wonders what it all means. All of a sudden, 2 fellows come out upon the white road from some black shadow, and they looked, and they let the gig go past, father's uncle driving hard, I warrant you. But for all that he heard one say to the other, 'Bah, there's 2 on 'em.' Straight on he drove faster than ever, till he saw the far lights of some town or other, but I forget its name, though I've heard it many a time. And then he drew a long breath, and turned his head to look at his brother, and ask him how he'd managed to come out of his grave in Barham churchyard, and the seat was as empty as it had been when he set out, and then he knew that it were a spirit come to help him against the men who thought to rob him. and would likely enough have murdered him." Kinraid had kept quiet through this story, but when the sailor began to draw the moral and to say, "And I think I may make bold to say, sir, as the marine who carried you out of the French's gunshot was just a spirit come to help you," he exclaimed impatiently, swearing a great oath as he did so, "it was no spirit, I tell you, and I was in my full senses. It was a man named Philip Hepburn. He said words to me or over me as none but himself would have said. Yet we hated each other like poison, and I can't make out why he should be there and putting himself in danger to save me. But so it was, and as you can't find him, let me hear no more of your nonsense. It was him, and not my fancy, doctor. It was flesh and blood, and not a spirit, Jack. So get along with you, and leave me quiet." All this time Stephen Freeman lay friendless, sick, and shattered on board the Theseus. He had been about his duty close to some shells that were placed on her deck. A gay young midshipman was thoughtlessly striving to get the fusee out of one of these by a mallet and spike-nail that lay close at hand, and a fearful explosion ensued, in which the poor marine, cleaning his bayonet near, was shockingly burned and disfigured, the very skin of all the lower part of his face being utterly destroyed by gunpowder. They said it was a mercy that his eyes were spared, but he could hardly feel anything to be a mercy, as he lay tossing in agony, burnt by the explosion, wounded by splinters, and feeling that he was disabled for life, if life itself were preserved. Of all that suffered by that fearful accident, and they were many, none was so forsaken, so hopeless, so desolate, as the Philip Hepburn, about whom such anxious inquiries were being made at that very time. End of chapter 38. Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shushan. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 39. Confidences. It was a little later on in that same summer that Mrs. Brunton came to visit her sister Bessie. Bessie was married to a tolerably well-to-do farmer, who lived at an almost equal distance between Monkshaven and Hartswell, but from old habit and convenience the latter was regarded as the Dawsons' market town, so Bessie seldom or never saw her old friends in Monkshaven. But Mrs. Brunton was far too flourishing a person not to speak out her wishes and have her own way. She had no notion, she said, of coming such a long journey only to see Bessie and her husband, and not to have a sight of her former acquaintances at Monkshaven. She might have added, that her new bonnet and cloak would be as good as lost if it was not displayed among those who, knowing her as Molly Corney, and being less fortunate in matrimony than she was, would look upon it with wondering admiration, if not with envy. So one day Farmer Dawson's market cart deposited Mrs. Brunton in all her bravery at the shop in the market-place, over which Hepburn and Coulson's names still flourished in joint partnership. After a few words of brisk recognition to Coulson and Hester, Mrs. Brunton passed on into the parlour and greeted Sylvia with boisterous heartiness. It was now 4 years and more since the friends had met, and each secretly wondered how they had ever come to be friends. Sylvia had a country, raw, spiritless look to Mrs. Brunton's eye. Molly was loud and talkative, and altogether distasteful to Sylvia, trained in daily companionship with Hester to appreciate soft, slow speech and grave, thoughtful ways. However, they kept up the forms of their old friendship, though their hearts had drifted far apart. They sat hand in hand, while each looked at the other with eyes inquisitive as to the changes which time had made. Molly was the first to speak. "Well, to be sure, how thin and pale you've grown, Sylvia! Matrimony hasn't agreed with you as well as it's done with me. Brunton is always saying, you know what a man he is for his joke, that if he'd ha' known how many yards of silk I should ha' taken for a gown, he'd ha' thought twice afore he'd ha' married me. Why, I've gained a matter of £30 of flesh sin' I were married." "You do look brave and hearty," said Sylvia, putting her sense of her companion's capacious size and high colour into the prettiest words she could. Sylvia, but I know what it is," said Molly, shaking her head. "It's just because of that husband of thine as has gone and left thee. Thou's pining after him, and he's not worth it. Brunton said when he heerd on it, I mind he was smoking at t' time, and he took his pipe out of his mouth, and shook out t' ashes as grave as any judge. 'The man,' says he, 'as can desert a wife like Sylvia Robson as was, deserves hanging.' That's what he says. Sylvia, but speaking of hanging, I was so grieved for you when I heard of your poor feyther. Such an end for a decent man to come to. Many a one come and called on me a purpose to hear all I could tell him about him. Please don't speak on it," said Sylvia, trembling all over. "Well, poor creature, I would not. It is hard on thee, I grant, but to give the devil his due, it were good of Hepburn to marry thee, and so soon after there was all that talk about thy feyther. Many a man would ha' drawn back, choose however far they'd gone. I'm noane so sure about Charlie Kinraid. Sylvia, only think on his being alive after all. I doubt if our Bessy would ha' wed Frank Dawson if she'd known as he wasn't drowned. But it's as well she did, for Dawson's a man of property, and has getten 12 cows in his cowhouse, beside 3 right down good horses. And Kinraid were allays a fellow with 2 strings to his bow. I've allays said, and do maintain, that he went on pretty strong with you, Sylvie. And I will say I think he cared more for you than for our Bessy, though it were only yesterday at e'en she were standing out that he liked her better than you. You'll ha' heerd on his grand marriage?" "No," said Sylvia, with eager, painful curiosity. "No! It was in all t' papers. I wonder as you didn't see it. Wait a minute. I cut it out of t' Gentleman's Magazine as Brunton bought o' purpose, and put it in my pocket book when I were a coming here. I know I've got it somewhere." She took out her smart crimson pocket book, and rummaged in the pocket until she produced a little crumpled bit of printed paper, from which she read aloud. "On January the 3rd, at St. Mary Redcliffe, Bristol, Charles Kinraid, Esquire, Lieutenant Royal Navy, to Miss Clarinda Jackson, with a fortune of £10,000. Theere!" she said triumphantly. "It's something as Brunton says to be cousin to that." "Would you let me see it?" said Sylvia timidly. Mrs. Brunton graciously consented, and Sylvia brought her newly acquired reading knowledge, hitherto principally exercised on the Old Testament, to bear on these words. There was nothing wonderful in them, nothing that she might not have expected, and yet the surprise turned her giddy for a moment or two. She never thought of seeing him again, never, but to think of his caring for another woman as much as he had done for her, nay, perhaps more. The idea was irresistibly forced upon her that Philip would not have acted so. It would have taken long years before he could have been induced to put another on the throne she had once occupied. For the first time in her life she seemed to recognize the real nature of Philip's love. But she said nothing but "Thank you" when she gave the scrap of paper back to Molly Brunton, and the latter continued giving her information about Kinraid's marriage. "He were down in t' west, Plymouth or somewhere, when he met with her. She's no feyther. He'd been into sugar baking business, but from what Kinraid wrote to old Turner, the uncle as brought him up at Cullercoats, she's had t' best of educations, can play on t' instrument and dance t' shawl dance. And Kinraid had all her money settled on her, though she said she'd rather give it all to him, which I must say, being his cousin, was very pretty on her. He's left her now, having to go off into Tigre, as is his ship, to the Mediterranean seas, and she's written to offer to come and see old Turner, and make friends with his relations, and Brunton is going to give me a crimson satin as soon as we know for certain when she's coming, for we're sure to be asked out to Cullercoats." "I wonder if she's very pretty?" asked Sylvia faintly, in the first pause in this torrent of talk. "Oh, she's a perfect beauty as I understand. There was a traveller as come to our shop as had been at York, and knew some of her cousins there that were in t' grocery line. Her mother was a York lady, and they said she was just a picture of a woman, and ever so many gentlemen had been wanting to marry her, but she just waited for Charlie Kinraid, you see." "Well, I hope they'll be happy. I'm sure I do," said Sylvia. "That's just luck. Some folks is happy in marriage, and some isn't. It's just luck, and there's no forecasting it. Men is such unaccountable animals, there's no prophesying upon 'em. Who'd ha' thought of your husband, him as was so slow and sure, steady Philip, as we lasses used to call him, making a moonlight flitting, and leaving you to be a widow bewitched?" "He didn't go at night," said Sylvia, taking the words moonlight flitting in their literal sense. No. Well, I only said moonlight flitting just because it come uppermost, and I knowed no better. Tell me all about it, Sylvie, for I can't make it out from what Bessie says. Had he and you had words? But in course you had." At this moment Hester came into the room, and Sylvia joyfully availed herself of the pretext for breaking off the conversation that had reached this painful and awkward point. She detained Hester in the room for fear lest Mrs. Brunton should repeat her inquiry as to how it all happened that Philip had gone away. But the presence of a third person seemed as though it would be but little restraint upon the inquisitive Molly, who repeatedly bore down upon the same questions till she nearly drove Sylvia distracted, between her astonishment at the news of Kinraid's marriage, her wish to be alone and quiet so as to realise the full meaning of that piece of intelligence, her desire to retain Hester in the conversation, her efforts to prevent Molly's recurrence to the circumstances of Philip's disappearance, and the longing, more vehement every minute, for her visitor to go away and leave her in peace. She became so disturbed with all these thoughts and feelings that she hardly knew what she was saying, and assented or dissented to speeches without there being either any reason or truth in her words. Mrs. Brunton had arranged to remain with Sylvia while the horse rested, and had no compunction about the length of her visit. She expected to be asked to tea, as Sylvia found out at last, and this she felt would be the worst of all, as Alice Rose was not one to tolerate the coarse, careless talk of such a woman as Mrs. Brunton, without lifting her voice in many a testimony against it. Sylvia sat holding Hester's gown tight in order to prevent her leaving the room, and trying to arrange her little plans so that too much discordance should not arise to the surface. Just then the door opened, and little Bella came in from the kitchen in all the pretty, sturdy dignity of 2 years old, Alice following her with careful steps, and protecting outstretched arms, a slow smile softening the sternness of her grave face, for the child was the unconscious darling of the household, and all eyes softened into love as they looked on her. She made straight for her mother with something grasped in her little dimpled fist, but halfway across the room she seemed to have become suddenly aware of the presence of a stranger, and she stopped short, fixing her serious eyes full on Mrs. Brunton, as if to take in her appearance, nay, as if to penetrate down into her very real self, and then, stretching out her disengaged hand, the baby spoke out the words that had been hovering about her mother's lips for an hour past. "Go away," said Bella decisively. "What a perfect love!" said Mrs. Brunton, half in real admiration, half in patronage. As she spoke, she got up and went towards the child, as if to take her up. "Go away, go away!" cried Bella in shrill affright at this movement. "Do not," said Sylvia. "She's shy. She doesn't know strangers." But Mrs. Brunton had grasped the struggling, kicking child by this time, and her reward for this was a vehement little slap in the face. "You naughty little spoiled thing," said she, setting Bella down in a hurry. "You deserve a good whipping, you do, and if you were mine you should have it." Sylvia had no need to stand up for the baby who had run to her arms, and was soothing herself with sobbing on her mother's breast, for Alice took up the defence. "The child said as plain as words could say, 'Go away,' and if thou wouldst follow thine own will instead of heeding her wish, thou mun put up with the wilfulness of the old Adam, of which it seems to me thou hast getten thy share at 30 as well as little Bella at 2. 30! said Mrs. Brunton, now fairly affronted. 30! Why, Sylvia, you know I'm but 2 years older than you. Speak to that woman and tell her as I'm only 24. 30 indeed." "Molly's but 24, said Sylvia in a pacificatory tone. "Whether she be 20 or 30 or 40 is alike to me," said Alice. "I meant no harm. I meant but for to say as her angry words to the child bespoke her to be one of the foolish. I know not who she is, nor what her age may be." "She's an old friend of mine," said Sylvia. "She's Mrs. Brunton now, but when I knowed her she was Molly Corney." "Ay, and you were Sylvia Robson, and as bonny and light-hearted a lass as any in all to riding, though now you're a poor widow bewitched, left wi' a child as I mustn't speak a word about, and living wi' folk as talk about t' old Adam as if he wasn't dead and done wi' long ago. It's a change, Sylvia, as makes my heart ache for you, to think on them old days when you were so thought on you might have had any man, as Brunton often says. It were a great mistake as you iver took up wi' yon man as has run away. But 7 year'll soon be past fro' t' time he went off, and you'll only be 26 then. And there'll be a chance of a better husband for you after all, so keep up your heart, Sylvia." Molly Brunton had put as much venom as she knew how into this speech, meaning it as a vengeful payment for the supposition of her being 30, even more than for the reproof for her angry words about the child. She thought that Alice Rose must be either mother or aunt to Philip, from the serious cast of countenance that was remarkable in both, and she rather exulted in the allusion to a happier second marriage for Sylvia, with which she had concluded her speech. It roused Alice, however, as effectually as if she had been really a blood relation to Philip, but for a different reason. She was not slow to detect the intentional offensiveness to herself in what had been said. She was indignant at Sylvia for suffering the words spoken to pass unanswered, but in truth they were too much in keeping with Molly Brunton's character to make as much impression on Sylvia as they did on a stranger. And besides, she felt as if the less reply Molly received, the less likely would it be that she would go on in the same strain. So she coaxed and chattered to her child, and behaved like a little coward in trying to draw out of the conversation, while at the same time listening attentively. "As for Sylvia Hepburn as was Sylvia Robson, she knows my mind," said Alice in grim indignation. "She's humbling herself now, I trust and pray. But she was light-minded and full of vanity when Philip married her, and it might have been a lift towards her salvation in one way. But it pleased the Lord to work in a different way, and she mun wear her sackcloth and ashes in patience. So I'll say not more about her. But for him as is absent as thee has spoken on so lightly and reproachfully, I'd have thee to know he were one of a different kind to any thee ever knew, I reckon. If he were led away by a pretty face to slight one as was fitter for him and who had loved him as the apple of her eye, it's him as is suffering for it, inasmuch as he's a wanderer from his home and an outcast from wife and child." To the surprise of all, Molly's words of reply were cut short even when they were on her lips, by Sylvia. Pale, fire-eyed, and excited, with Philip's child on one arm and the other stretched out, she said, "No one can tell, no one know. No one shall speak a judgment twixt Philip and me. He acted cruel and wrong by me, but I've said my words to him hisself, and I'm not going to make any plaint to others. Only them as know should judge. And it's not fitting, it's not," almost sobbing, "to go on with talk like this afore me." The two, for Hester, who was aware that her presence had only been desired by Sylvia as a check to an unpleasant tete-a-tete conversation, had slipped back to her business as soon as her mother came in. The two looked with surprise at Sylvia. Her words, her whole manner, belonged to a phase of her character which seldom came uppermost, and which had not been perceived by either of them before. Alice Rose, though astonished, rather approved of Sylvia's speech. It showed that she had more serious thought and feeling on the subject than the old woman had given her credit for. Her general silence respecting her husband's disappearance had led Alice to think that she was too childish to have received any deep impression from the event. Molly Brunton gave vent to her opinion on Sylvia's speech in the following words: "Hoity-toity, that tells tales, lass. If you treated steady Philip to many such looks and speeches as yo'n given us now, it's easy to see why he took hisself off. Why, Sylvia, I niver saw it in you when you was a girl. You're grown into a regular little vixen, there where you stand." Indeed, she did look defiant, with the swift colour flushing her cheeks to crimson on its return, and the fire in her eyes not yet died away. But at Molly's jesting words she sank back into her usual look and manner, only saying quietly, "It's for no one to say whether I'm vixen or not, as doesn't know the past things as is buried in my heart. But I cannot hold them as my friends as go on talking on either my husband or me before my very face. What he was, I know, and what I am, I reckon he knows. And now I'll go hurry tea, for you'll be needing it, Molly." The last clause of this speech was meant to make peace, but Molly was in 20 minds as to whether she should accept the olive branch or not. Her temper, however, was of that obtuse kind which is not easily ruffled. Her mind, stagnant in itself, enjoyed excitement from without, and her appetite was invariably good, so she stayed, in spite of the inevitable tete-a-tete with Alice. The latter, however, refused to be drawn into conversation again, replying to Mrs. Brunton's speeches with a curt yes or no, when indeed she replied at all. When all were gathered at tea, Sylvia was quite calm again, rather paler than usual, and very attentive and subdued in her behaviour to Alice. She would evidently fain have been silent, but as Molly was her own especial guest, that could not be, so all her endeavours went towards steering the conversation away from any awkward points. But each of the four, let alone little Bella, was thankful when the market cart drew up at the shop door that was to take Mrs. Brunton back to her sister's house. When she was fairly off, Alice Rose opened her mouth in strong condemnation, winding up with, "And if aught in my words give thee cause for offence, Sylvia, it was because my heart rose within me at that kind of talk thee and she had been having about Philip, and her evil and light-minded counsel to thee about waiting 7 years and then wedding another." Hard as these words may seem when repeated, there was something of a nearer approach to an apology in Mrs. Rose's manner than Sylvia had ever seen in it before. She was silent for a few moments, then she said, "I ha' often thought of telling you and Hester special like, when you have been so kind to my little Bella, that Philip and me could never come together again, no, not if he came home this very night." She would have gone on speaking, but Hester interrupted her with a low cry of dismay. Alice said, "Hush thee, Hester, it's no business of thine. Sylvia Hepburn, thou art speaking like a silly child." "No, I am speaking like a woman as finds out she's been cheated by men as she trusted, and has no help for it. I'm not going to say any more about it. It's me as has been wronged and as has to bear it. Only I thought I'd tell you both this much, that you might know somewhat why he went away, and how I said my last word about it." So indeed it seemed. To all questions and remonstrances from Alice, Sylvia turned a deaf ear. She averted her face from Hester's sad, wistful looks. Only when they were parting for the night at the top of the little staircase she turned, and putting her arms round Hester's neck, she laid her head on her neck and whispered, "Poor Hester, poor, poor Hester! If you and he had but been married together, what a deal of sorrow would have been spared to us all." Hester pushed her away as she finished these words, looked searchingly into her face, her eyes, and then followed Sylvia into her room, where Bella lay sleeping, shut the door, and almost knelt down at Sylvia's feet, clasping her, and hiding her face in the folds of the other's gown. "Sylvia, Sylvia!" she murmured, "some one has told you. I thought no one knew. It's no sin. It's done away with now. Indeed it is. It was long ago, before you were married. But I cannot forget. It was a shame, perhaps, to have thought on it ever, when he never thought of me. But I never believed as any one could have found it out. I'm just fit to sink into ground, what with my sorrow and my shame." Hester was stopped by her own rising sobs immediately she was in Sylvia's arms. Sylvia was sitting on the ground holding her and soothing her with caresses and broken words. "I'm always saying the wrong things," said she. "It seems as if I were all upset to day, and indeed I am," she added, alluding to the news of Kinraid's marriage she had yet to think upon. "But it wasn't you, Hester. It were nothing you ever said or did, or looked for that matter. It were your mother as let it out." "Oh, mother, mother!" wailed out Hester. "I never thought as any one but God would ha' known that I had ever for a day thought on his being more to me than a brother." Sylvia made no reply, only went on stroking Hester's smooth brown hair, off which her cap had fallen. Sylvia was thinking how strange life was, and how love seemed to go all at cross purposes, and was losing herself in bewilderment at the mystery of the world. She was almost startled when Hester rose up, and taking Sylvia's hands in both of hers, and looking solemnly at her, said, "Sylvia, you know what has been my trouble and my shame, and I'm sure you're sorry for me. For I will humble myself to you, and own that for many months before you were married, I felt my disappointment like a heavy burden laid on me by day and by night. But now I ask you if you've any pity for me for what I went through, or if you've any love for me because of your dead mother's love for me, or because of any fellowship or daily brotherliness between us two. Put the hard thoughts of Philip away from out of your heart. He may ha' done you wrong, any way you think that he has. I never knew him aught but kind and good. But if he comes back from wherever in the wide world he's gone to, and there's not a night but I pray God to keep him and send him safe back, you put away the memory of past injury, and forgive it all, and be what you can be, Sylvia, if you've a mind to, just the kind, good wife he ought to have." "I cannot. You know nothing about it, Hester." "Tell me then," pleaded Hester. "No," said Sylvia, after a moment's hesitation. "I'd do a deal for you, I would, but I daren't forgive Philip, even if I could. I took a great oath again him. You may look shocked at me, but it's him as you ought for to be shocked at if you knew all. I said I'd niver forgive him. I shall keep to my word." "I think I'd better pray for his death, then," said Hester, hopelessly, and almost bitterly, losing her hold on Sylvia's hands. "If it weren't for baby there, I could think as it were my death as'd be best. Them as one thinks to most on forgets one soonest." It was Kinraid to whom she was alluding, but Hester did not understand her, and after standing for a moment in silence, she kissed her and left her for the night. End of chapter 39. Recording by Shushan.